Sometimes the cruelest betrayals come from those who should protect us. Elira had lived her whole life being told she wasn't worthy of love, dismissed and mocked by people who never bothered to see her heart. When the lords of Nareth needed a bride for the feared vampire Lord Kaelen, they chose her as their insult, a woman they believed would disgrace him and break their peace treaty. They thought her size and gentle nature made her worthless, but Kaelen had lived 3 centuries watching beautiful people do ugly things. What he saw in Elira was something precious, real kindness, quiet strength, and a spirit that cruelty couldn't break. In his cold mountain castle, something neither of them expected began to bloom. What were Kaelen's shocking plans for the bride no one wanted? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The kingdom of Nareth had known only winter for as long as anyone could remember. Snow crowned the ancient stone towers that pierced the grey sky like accusatory fingers, and frost painted delicate patterns on windows that rarely saw sunlight. In the great hall of Castle Nareth, where tapestries depicted long-dead kings and their glorious battles, the current lords huddled around a fire that seemed too small for the vast space it was meant to warm. Elira moved quietly among them, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the cold flagstones. She carried a tray of mulled wine, the steam rising from the pewter cups like incense in the frigid air. The lords barely glanced at her as she served them. To them, she was little more than furniture, useful but unremarkable. Lord Aldrich, a man whose belly strained against his velvet doublet, waved dismissively when she approached. "Away with you, girl," he muttered, not bothering to look up from the parchment he was studying. "Can't you see we're discussing matters of importance?" Elira bobbed a small curtsy and retreated to the shadows near the great hearth. She had learned long ago that invisibility was her greatest shield. At 25, she had spent her entire life in service to the noble houses, passed from one castle to another when her presence became inconvenient. Her curves, which the fashion of the time deemed unfashionable, made her the target of cruel jokes and casual dismissals. But Elira had discovered that people said their most honest words when they forgot she was listening. "The vampire grows impatient," Lord Aldrich continued, his voice carrying the weight of barely contained fear. His last message made it clear that our treaty hangs by a thread. Lord Brennan, younger but no less arrogant, leaned forward in his chair. 300 years of peace, and it all comes down to this absurd demand. A bride. As if we're some tribal barbarians trading daughters for cattle. "Watch your tongue," hissed Lord Aldrich. "The blood wars cost us half our kingdom." Would you see those days return? When vampires swept down from the mountains like death itself? When no family could sleep safely in their beds? The memory of those dark times lived in every stone of the castle. Elira had heard the stories from the older servants, tales of nights when the sky rained blood and morning revealed villages emptied of life. The peace treaty, signed in both ink and blood 3 centuries ago, had brought an end to the horror. But peace, like all things precious, came with a price. "Lord Kaelen has honoured every provision of our agreement," Lord Aldrich continued. "His people stay in their mountain strongholds, they hunt only animals, and they've given us 3 centuries without a single human death. In return, we've provided them with willing servants who chose their fate, craftsmen who trade freely with their kind, and the occasional noble bride when alliances were needed." He paused, his weathered face grim. "This is not a request we can deny." Elira's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the poker by the fire. She knew of Lord Kaelen. Everyone in the kingdom did. He was the alpha vampire, the one who had ended the blood wars not through conquest, but through surprising mercy. Stories painted him as a figure of terrible beauty and ancient power, a being who had walked the earth since before their grandparents' grandparents were born. "The problem," Lord Brennan said, lowering his voice, "is finding a suitable bride. Our daughters are already promised, and we cannot risk offending our human allies by withdrawing from those arrangements. Besides," added Lord Aldrich with a cruel smile, "what father would willingly send his daughter to wed a monster, treaty or no treaty?" The words hung in the air like frost. Elira had heard this conversation, building for weeks, whispered in corridors and discussed in hushed tones behind closed doors. The vampire lord had sent word that he wished to take a bride, not for political alliance, but for reasons he had not shared. The request had thrown the human nobility into chaos. "Perhaps," Lord Brennan said slowly, his eyes taking on a calculating gleam, "we don't need to send someone of noble birth." Lord Aldrich raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "The treaty specifies a bride from the human kingdom, but it doesn't specify her station. What if we send someone someone whose presence might actually insult the vampire? Make him reconsider his demand entirely?" The cruelty in his tone made Elira's stomach clench, though she kept her face carefully neutral. She had learned to recognize that particular quality in men's voices, the sound they made when they were about to cause pain for their own amusement. "You're suggesting we deliberately provoke him?" Lord Aldrich asked, though his voice carried interest rather than outrage. "I'm suggesting we send him exactly what he asked for, but in such a way that he'll release us from this obligation, someone so unsuitable that even his ancient pride couldn't stomach the arrangement." Lord Aldrich leaned back in his chair, studying his younger companion. "And whom did you have in mind?" Lord Brennan's gaze swept the hall and landed on Elira. She felt the weight of his stare like a physical thing, cold and calculating. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. "Her," he said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the fire seemed to quiet, as if the flames themselves were holding their breath. Lord Aldrich followed Brennan's gaze and studied Elira with the clinical interest of a man appraising livestock. "The serving girl," he mused. "She's hardly what one would call a beauty." "Exactly." Lord Brennan's smile was sharp as a blade. "Can you imagine the vampire's reaction when we present her as his intended bride? A woman of her proportions. It's perfect. He'll be so offended by what he sees as our mockery that he'll void the marriage demand entirely. We maintain the treaty while ridding ourselves of this impossible obligation." Elira's hand went instinctively to the simple silver locket at her throat, the only thing of value she possessed. It had been her mother's, containing a pressed flower from the garden where Elira had been born. Her mother, who had died when Elira was barely old enough to remember her face, had always told her that true beauty came from the heart. But standing in that cold hall, listening to men discuss her as if she were a piece of furniture to be disposed of, those words felt like empty comfort. "There's risk in this plan," Lord Aldrich warned, though his tone suggested he was already considering it. "If the vampire sees through our intentions, then we claim innocence," Lord Brennan interrupted. "We provided exactly what he requested, a bride from our kingdom. If she doesn't meet his standards, that's hardly our fault. We can offer apologies and suggest he reconsider his demand for a more practical arrangement." The two men continued their discussion, but Elira barely heard the words. Her mind raced with the implications of what they were planning. To be sent to the vampire lord as some sort of cruel joke, to be placed in the path of a being whose power was beyond human comprehension, the thought terrified her. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A small, stubborn voice that whispered that perhaps anywhere was better than here, in this cold castle where she was valued less than the stones in the walls. "It's settled then," Lord Aldrich declared, raising his cup in a mock toast. "We'll prepare the girl for her wedding journey. A bride for the alpha vampire, delivered as requested." As the lords returned to their wine and their cruel laughter, Elira slipped away into the corridor. Her small chamber, barely more than a closet near the kitchens, felt like a sanctuary after the horror of that conversation. She sat on her narrow bed, clutching her mother's locket, and tried to imagine what fate awaited her. The stories of Lord Kaelen were contradictory. Some painted him as a monster of unimaginable cruelty, while others spoke of his unexpected mercy during the treaty negotiations. Some said he was beautiful beyond description, others that he was a creature of shadow and nightmare. None of the stories prepared her for the reality that she would soon discover, that sometimes the most dangerous thing about a powerful being is not their capacity for destruction, but their ability to see the truth that others miss. Outside her window, snow continued to fall on the kingdom of Nareth, each flake unique and perfect in its brief existence before joining the endless white that covered their world. Elira watched the snow dance in the wind and wondered if she, too, might find purpose in her brief moment before whatever end awaited her in the vampire lord's mountain stronghold. 3 days later, Elira stood in the castle courtyard as dawn broke grey and cold over the mountains. The midnight carriage waited before her like a beautiful nightmare. Its black lacquered wood gleamed despite the overcast sky, and silver fittings caught what little light filtered through the clouds. Intricate carvings of roses and thorns wound around the door frames, and the horses that would pull it were magnificent beasts with coats like polished obsidian and eyes that seemed far too intelligent. "Well, don't just stand there gawking," Lord Brennan snapped, though his voice carried a note of nervous satisfaction. "The vampire expects his bride to arrive before nightfall." Elira clutched a small cloth bundle containing her few possessions: 2 simple dresses, her mother's locket, and a worn book of poetry that had been her constant companion through lonely years. The wedding dress they had given her was beautiful in a mocking way, white silk with delicate embroidery that had probably cost more than she would have earned in 5 years of service. It felt like wearing a costume for a play she didn't understand. "Remember," Lord Aldrich said, approaching with the ceremonial scroll that contained the marriage contract, "you are representing our kingdom. Conduct yourself with whatever dignity you can manage." The word stung, though Elira had expected nothing else. She had spent the last 3 days listening to servants whisper about her fate, some with pity, others with cruel amusement. The general consensus seemed to be that she was walking to her death, though opinions varied on how quickly it would come. "My lord," she said quietly, finding her voice at last, "may I ask what I am to tell Lord Kaelen about the nature of our arrangement?" Lord Brennan's smile was cold. "You tell him nothing. You are a bride sent in accordance with the treaty, nothing more. What he chooses to do with you is his affair." The carriage driver, a thin man whose pale skin and 2 bright eyes marked him as one of the vampire lord's servants, stepped down from his seat. When he spoke, his voice carried the soft accent of the mountain territories. "My lady," he said, offering her a surprisingly courteous bow, "I am Marcus, and I will see you safely to Lord Kaelen's domain. The journey will take most of the day, but the carriage is well appointed for comfort." His kindness, unexpected after days of cruel preparation, nearly brought tears to Elira's eyes. She managed a small smile and allowed him to help her into the carriage. The interior was indeed luxurious: soft velvet seats, fur-lined blankets, and a small selection of books tied with silk ribbon. Someone had prepared for her comfort with thoughtful care. As the carriage began to move, Elira pressed her face to the window and watched Castle Nareth disappear behind them. The Lord stood in the courtyard, and she could see Lord Brennan gesturing animatedly, no doubt already celebrating what he believed would be the vampire's humiliation. She felt a strange mixture of fear and relief as the only home she had ever known faded into the grey morning. The journey through the mountains was breathtaking in its harsh beauty. Pine forests stretched endlessly on either side of the winding road, their branches heavy with snow that sparkled like diamonds when brief shafts of sunlight pierced the clouds. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed higher, and Elira found herself grateful for the warm blankets and the heated stones that Marcus had thoughtfully provided. As the hours passed, her fear began to mix with something else: curiosity. The stories about Lord Kaelen were so contradictory that she wondered if anyone truly knew what manner of being he was. Some tales spoke of his terrible beauty, others of his monstrous appearance. Some claimed he was cruel beyond measure, while others whispered that he had shown unexpected mercy to human prisoners during the old wars. The carriage jolted suddenly, pulling her from her thoughts. Through the window she saw that they had arrived at a massive iron gate, set into what appeared to be the living rock of the mountain itself. 2 guards in dark armor flanked the entrance, and Elira noticed with a start that their skin had the same pale quality as Marcus's. Vampires, she realized, though they looked far more human than the monsters of legend. "We have arrived, my lady," Marcus called down. "Lord Kaelen's stronghold lies just ahead." The gates swung open silently, and the carriage rolled through into a courtyard that took Elira's breath away. The Vampire Lord's castle was carved directly from the mountain, its soaring spires and elegant arches flowing naturally from the stone, as if they had grown there over centuries. Torches burned in sconces along the walls, casting dancing shadows that made the carving seem alive. But it was not the architecture that struck her most. It was the sense of order and beauty that pervaded everything she saw. Gardens of winter, roses bloomed impossibly in the mountain air, their red petals stark against the white snow. The courtyard was swept clean, and servants moved about their duties with quiet efficiency, rather than the hurried fear she had expected. The carriage came to a stop before the main entrance, where wide steps led up to doors of dark wood, bound with silver. Marcus opened her door and offered his hand again, his expression kind. "Lord Kaelen is waiting to receive you in the great hall," he said gently. "Do not be afraid, my lady. Our Lord is not the monster your people believe him to be." Elira stepped from the carriage on trembling legs, clutching her small bundle. The mountain air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something that reminded her of old libraries and candle wax. 2 female servants approached, both with the pale complexion that marked them as vampires, but their faces were warm and welcoming. "My lady," the elder of the 2 said with a deep curtsy. "I am Helena, the castle's head of household. This is Sarah, who will attend to your immediate needs. Lord Kaelen has asked that we ensure your comfort before the formal introduction." "Thank you," Elira managed, surprised again by the courtesy. "That's very kind." Helena smiled, and Elira noticed that her teeth, while sharp, were not the terrible fangs of legend. "Kindness is valued highly in this household, my lady. Lord Kaelen insists upon it." They led her through corridors that defied every expectation she had carried. The castle was warm, lit by countless candles, and warmed by fires that burned in every room. Tapestries depicting not battles, but beautiful scenes of nature adorned the walls, and she glimpsed libraries filled with more books than she had ever seen in one place. "Your chambers are prepared," Sarah said, as they climbed a curved staircase. "But Lord Kaelen wished to meet with you as soon as you arrived, if you feel ready." Elira's heart hammered against her ribs. The moment she had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure was upon her. "I suppose there's no point in delaying the inevitable." Helena stopped and turned to face her, her expression serious but not unkind. "My lady, may I offer you some advice? Lord Kaelen is not what your people have told you to expect. Keep an open mind, and you may find that your fears are misplaced." They reached the great hall, and Helena pushed open the massive doors. The room beyond was magnificent, high ceilings supported by pillars of carved stone, windows that looked out over the mountain vista, and a fireplace large enough to stand in. But Elira barely registered the grandeur, because standing with his back to them, looking out at the snow-covered peaks, was Lord Kaelen himself. He was tall, that much she could see, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders and a bearing that spoke of absolute confidence. When he turned to face them, Elira felt her breath catch in her throat. The stories had been right about his beauty, but they had failed to capture the intelligence in his dark eyes, the subtle humor that played around his mouth, or the way he moved with a fluid grace that spoke of centuries of existence. "Lady Elira," he said, and his voice was deep and warm, carrying just a hint of the accent she had heard in Marcus's speech. "Welcome to my home." He approached her with measured steps, and Elira found herself frozen between the urge to flee and the strange compulsion to step closer. When he stopped before her and offered a formal bow, a gesture of respect that no human lord had ever shown her, she felt the last of her preconceptions crumble. "My lord," she managed, offering her own curtsy with hands that shook only slightly. When she looked up, she found him studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was no disgust in his face, no anger at what he might see as an insult. Instead, his dark eyes held something that looked almost like recognition. "You must be tired from your journey," he said gently. "Perhaps you would join me for dinner, and we can become acquainted properly." It was not what she had expected. No demands, no accusations, no immediate dismissal. Just a polite invitation, spoken with genuine courtesy. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Elira felt a small spark of something that might have been hope. "I would be honored, my lord," she replied, and meant it. The dining hall was smaller than the great hall, but no less impressive, with a long table of polished dark wood and chairs carved with the same rose and thorn motifs that decorated the carriage. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting warm light that danced across the stone walls. Elira had expected to dine alone with Lord Kaelen, but she found several other residents of the castle already seated, vampires all, but their faces were welcoming rather than threatening. "Allow me to introduce my household," Kaelen said, guiding her to a chair at his right hand. "Helena you have met. This is Thomas, my steward, and his wife, Margaret. Dr. Whitmore serves as our physician and scholar. And this young lady is Eleanor, my ward." Eleanor appeared to be barely 16, with the pale complexion of her kind, but eyes that sparkled with curiosity. "My lady," she said with barely contained excitement, "we've been so looking forward to your arrival. It's been ages since we've had another woman in the castle." "Elena," Dr. Whitmore said mildly, "perhaps allow Lady Elira to settle in before overwhelming her with enthusiasm." Elira found herself smiling despite her nervousness. "Please, just Elira. And I'm not overwhelmed. It's refreshing to receive such a warm welcome." As the meal progressed, Elira discovered that her fears of vampire dining habits were unfounded. The food was expertly prepared: roasted fowl with herbs, vegetables from the castle's greenhouse, fresh bread that filled the air with its aroma. The vampires ate with obvious enjoyment, and she noticed that, while they drank wine, there was no sign of the blood she had expected. "You seem surprised by our table," Kaelen observed quietly, his voice meant for her alone. "I confess I am," Elira replied honestly. "The stories we hear in the human lands are different." "Stories have a way of growing in the telling," he said with a slight smile. 3 centuries ago, my people were indeed what your legends describe. Hunger drove us to terrible acts. But hunger can be overcome, just as any other base impulse can be mastered with will and time. And you have mastered it. "We sustain ourselves in ways that harm no one," he said simply. "Animals provide what we need, and certain plants that grow only in these mountains supplement our diet. It took many years to learn, but the effort was worthwhile." Margaret leaned forward from across the table. Lord Kaelen researched for decades to find alternatives. He refused to allow his people to continue the old ways once the treaty was signed. "The old ways brought nothing but suffering," Kaelen said, his voice carrying the weight of regret. "For humans and vampires alike, I have seen enough death to last several lifetimes." After dinner, Kaelen offered to show her the castle's library, and Elira accepted eagerly. The Library of Memories, as Elena had called it, was vast beyond anything she had imagined. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books, scrolls, and manuscripts in languages she couldn't identify. The air smelled of leather and parchment, and comfortable chairs were scattered throughout the space near reading lamps. "This is magnificent," Elira breathed, turning slowly to take in the scope of the collection. "I've never seen so many books in one place." "The accumulation of 3 centuries," Kaelen said, watching her reaction with evident pleasure. "I've always been drawn to learning, and my condition provides ample time for study. These volumes contain the histories of dozens of kingdoms, philosophical treatises, poetry from every age, scientific discoveries, knowledge gathered from across the known world." Elira approached one of the shelves and ran her fingers along the spine of a volume of poetry. "In the human castle, I had only one book. I read it so many times I could recite it from memory." "Which book?" "A collection of verses about nature and the seasons. My mother left it to me." She paused, suddenly self-conscious. "I suppose that sounds foolish to someone with all this." "Not foolish at all," Kaelen said firmly. "A single book read with love is worth more than 1,000 volumes that gather dust." "What was your favorite poem?" Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks. "There was one about a winter rose that bloomed despite the cold. I always imagined it finding beauty and purpose, even when everything around it seemed harsh and unwelcoming." Something shifted in Kaelen's expression, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. "Would you like to see the greenhouse tomorrow? We have winter roses that might interest you. You have roses growing in this climate. Among other things, the mountains hold more life than most people realize." He gestured to a comfortable chair near the fireplace. "Please, make yourself at home here. Consider this library yours to enjoy whenever you wish." As they settled into chairs before the fire, Elira felt some of her tension begin to ease. This was so far from what she had expected that she was beginning to wonder if she was dreaming. "My lord, may I ask you something?" Of course. And please, when we're speaking privately, call me Kaelen. Titles create distance, and I prefer honest conversation. Very well, Kaelen. Why did you request a bride? The treaty has functioned well for 3 centuries without such arrangements. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of vulnerability she hadn't expected. Loneliness is a poor companion, even for one who has lived as long as I have. Perhaps especially for one who has lived as long as I have. I thought it might be time to try something different. And you weren't concerned about the kind of bride they might send? His smile was rueful. I suspected they would try to insult me. Yes, your human lords are predictable in their cruelty. But I confess I was curious to see what form their spite would take. And now that you've seen? Kaelen turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes serious. I see a woman who has been undervalued by people too blind to recognize worth when it stands before them. I see someone who speaks honestly without malice, who finds joy in simple pleasures like books and poetry. I see strength that has been tested by unkindness, but not broken by it. Elira felt tears prick at her eyes. No one had ever spoken of her with such respect, such careful observation of her character rather than her appearance. You speak as if you know me, but we've just met. I've learned to read people over the years, he said gently. It's a necessary skill when you have enemies. But more than that, I recognize something in you that I had almost forgotten existed. Genuine kindness without expectation of reward. The lords who sent me hoped you would be offended by my presence. Then they underestimated both of us, Kaelen said with quiet conviction. I stopped caring about conventional beauty long ago. I've known too many beautiful people with ugly hearts to be impressed by appearances alone. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire dance in the grate. Elira found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way shadows played across his features, the sense of contained power that radiated from him, even in repose. He was indeed beautiful, but it was a beauty tempered by obvious intelligence and something that might have been loneliness. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now you rest, recover from your journey, and we get to know one another properly, he replied. There's no hurry for any decisions. This is your home for as long as you wish it to be, whether our arrangement progresses or not. You would allow me to stay even if we prove incompatible? Of course. I would hardly send you back to people who used you so callously. His voice carried a note of steel. You're under my protection now, and I don't take that responsibility lightly. As Helena arrived to escort her to her chambers, Elira felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate kind born of desperation, but the quiet variety that came from being treated with unexpected kindness. Her rooms were beautiful, a sitting area with bookshelves and comfortable chairs, a bedchamber with a fireplace and windows that looked out over the mountains, and a small study with a writing desk. Fresh flowers sat in vases, and someone had left a selection of books on the table. As she prepared for sleep in the softest bed she had ever known, Elira touched her mother's locket and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Whatever tomorrow brought, tonight she was warm, safe, and for the first time in her life, valued. Elira woke to sunlight streaming through her windows, the first true sunlight she had seen in months. The view from her chambers was breathtaking. Snow-covered peaks stretched endlessly into the distance, and below in the castle courtyard, she could see the impossible sight of gardens blooming despite the winter cold. A soft knock at her door announced Sarah's arrival with breakfast and warm water for washing. "Good morning, my lady," the young vampire said cheerfully. "Lord Kaelen wondered if you might like to see the greenhouse after you break your fast. The morning light makes it particularly beautiful." An hour later, Elira found herself walking beside Kaelen through corridors she hadn't seen the night before. He had dressed simply, dark wool and leather, rather than the formal attire she might have expected from a lord. In the daylight streaming through tall windows, she could see him more clearly, and she was struck again by how different he was from the monster of legend. "You don't burn in sunlight," she observed, then immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. "Another myth that serves our purposes," he replied with amusement. "We're somewhat more sensitive to bright light than humans, but hardly the creatures of pure darkness your stories describe. I quite enjoy mornings like this one." They passed through a door she hadn't noticed before, and stepped into what could only be described as paradise. The Garden of Eternal Winter was a vast greenhouse with a glass ceiling that caught and magnified the mountain sunlight. Inside, an impossible variety of flowers bloomed in defiance of the season, roses of every color, jasmine that perfumed the air with sweetness, exotic blooms she couldn't name that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "This is impossible," Elira breathed, turning slowly to take in the wonder of it. "How do they survive in this climate?" "Magic has its practical applications," Kaelen said, leading her down a path between the flower beds. "The glass holds warmth, and the mountain itself provides heat through underground springs. But mostly, I think they bloom because they choose to, because they've found a place where they're valued and protected." Elira caught the subtle meaning in his words and felt warmth spread through her chest. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and she found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. There was something peaceful about this place, something that made the constant tension she carried begin to ease. "Tell me about your life before," Kaelen said, as they paused beside a fountain where water trickled musically over carved stone. "What were your days like in the human castle?" "Unremarkable," Elira replied honestly. "I woke before dawn, helped prepare meals, served at table, cleaned, mended clothing. I tried to remain invisible and useful." She touched a red rose bloom, marveling at its perfection. "I read when I could find time alone, usually late at night by candlelight." "And before the castle? Your family?" Elira's hand went instinctively to her locket. "My mother died when I was very young. I barely remember her, except that she was kind and loved flowers. My father, I never knew him. Mother said he was a traveling scholar, but I suspect that was a gentle fiction to spare me harder truths." "So you've been alone most of your life?" "Yes, though I learned early that being alone and being lonely aren't always the same thing. Books were good companions, and there were a few servants over the years who showed me kindness." She paused, then added quietly, "What about you? Have you always been alone?" Kaelen's expression grew distant. "Not always. I was turned during a plague that swept through my homeland, centuries ago, when I was barely older than Eleanor is now. My maker was kind, in his way, but he died in the early years of the Blood Wars. I've had companions since then, but relationships are complex when one party will age and die, while the other remains unchanged. That must be difficult." "It is. I've learned to cherish the time I have with people while accepting its brevity. But lately, I've found myself wondering if there might be another way." He turned to look at her directly, Your people would be horrified to learn this, but vampires can share their condition through choice rather than chance. It's not something done lightly, and never without consent. But it's possible. Elira felt her pulse quicken. You're telling me this because I believe in honesty, and because I want you to understand all the possibilities before you. I'm not suggesting anything, merely ensuring you have complete information. They continued walking, and Elira found her mind racing with the implications of what he had shared. The idea of eternal life was both terrifying and strangely appealing, especially if it meant freedom from the petty cruelties of human society. "May I ask you something personal?" she said after a while. "Of course." "Why haven't you taken a companion before now? Surely in 3 centuries you must have met others who might have been suitable." Kaelen was quiet for so long that she began to worry she had overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I did, once. Her name was Catherine, and she was everything your people would consider perfect. Beautiful, noble, accomplished. I was younger then, more easily swayed by surface attractions." "What happened?" "She was horrified by what I offered. The idea of sharing my condition, of giving up her humanity, it repulsed her. She tolerated me as long as she thought I might change back into something human. But when she realized the permanence of what I am—" He shrugged, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. "She left in the night, taking several valuable items with her. I heard later that she had married a human lord and spread tales about the monster who had tried to corrupt her. I'm sorry. That must have been terribly painful. It taught me an important lesson about the difference between attraction and acceptance. Since then, I've been more cautious about opening myself to such possibilities." They had reached a section of the greenhouse where climbing roses created natural alcoves, and Kaelen gestured to a bench carved from white stone. As they sat, Elira found herself studying his profile again, trying to reconcile this thoughtful, vulnerable man with the stories she had grown up hearing. "The lords who sent me believed you would be insulted by my appearance," she said quietly. "They thought you would send me back in disgust. And what do you think now that you've met me? Are you disgusted by what I am?" Elira considered the question seriously. "No. Confused, perhaps. Surprised, certainly. Everything I was taught about your kind seems to be wrong. But disgusted? No. Fear is natural," he said gently. "I wouldn't think less of you for being afraid." "I was afraid," she admitted. "Terrified, actually. But fear and disgust aren't the same thing. And the more I see of your true nature, the less afraid I become." Kaelen smiled, and she noticed again how it transformed his entire face. "You're remarkably honest for someone raised in a court environment." "Dishonesty requires more energy than I've ever had to spare," Elira replied. "Besides, what would be the point of pretending with you? You seem to see through deception easily enough." Another useful skill developed over time. He stood and offered her his arm. "Would you like to see the rest of the castle? I think you might enjoy the tower library. It has the best view of the mountains." As they walked back toward the castle proper, Elira realized that something fundamental had shifted in her thinking. The fear and resignation that had characterized her journey here were giving way to something else: curiosity, interest, and perhaps the beginning of genuine affection for this complex, lonely man who saw value in her when no one else ever had. A week had passed since Elira's arrival at the castle, and she had begun to understand that her initial impressions had only scratched the surface of the complex world Kaelen had built in these mountains. Each day brought new discoveries, secret passages that led to hidden libraries, workshops where vampire artisans created works of breathtaking beauty, and gardens where impossible things grew under the careful tending of those who had mastered both magic and patience. She was exploring one of the smaller libraries when Helena found her, the older woman's expression unusually grave. "My lady," Helena said, closing the door behind her, "Lord Kaelen has received troubling news from the human kingdoms. He's asked me to bring you to his study." Elira's heart sank. She had been dreading this moment, when the outside world would intrude on the peaceful bubble of safety she had found here. She followed Helena through corridors she was still learning to navigate, until they reached a heavy oak door bound with iron. Kaelen's study reflected the man himself. Books and maps covered every surface, but the organization spoke of a methodical mind. Ancient weapons hung on the walls alongside artistic masterpieces, and the desk was carved from a single massive piece of dark wood that must have been centuries old. Kaelen stood with his back to them, staring out the tall window at the mountain vista. In his hand was a piece of parchment bearing what Elira recognized as the seal of the human court. "Thank you, Helena," he said without turning. "Please ensure we're not disturbed." When they were alone, Kaelen finally faced her, and Elira was troubled by the tension she saw in his features. "What is it?" she asked. "What's happened?" "Your former lords have written to inquire about their gift," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "They're quite eager to know whether I found their choice of bride satisfactory." "And what did you tell them?" "Nothing yet. But their letter makes it clear that they expect me to reject their offering and void the marriage requirement of our treaty." He set the parchment on his desk with deliberate care. "They're quite transparent in their expectations." Elira felt the familiar sting of humiliation, though it was dulled now by anger. "So they're still hoping their cruel joke will succeed." "It seems so." Kaelen moved to a cabinet and withdrew something Elira hadn't seen before, an ornate crown of black metal and dark gems that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The crown of thorns, she realized, recognizing it from descriptions in old stories. "I haven't worn this in decades. I put it away when I decided that ruling through fear was less effective than leading through respect." "Why are you showing it to me now?" "Because wearing it again might be necessary." His expression was grim. "The human lords aren't the only ones questioning recent developments. Some of my own people are concerned about the implications of my taking a human bride." As if summoned by his words, a knock came at the study door. Kaelen called permission to enter, and Elira was surprised to see Dr. Whitmore, accompanied by 3 vampires she hadn't met, 2 men and a woman, all bearing themselves with the bearing of nobility. "Lord Kaelen," Dr. Whitmore said formally, "may I present Lord Victor, Lady Morgana, and Lord Sebastian. They've traveled from the Eastern Territories to discuss the recent developments." The 3 newcomers studied Elira, with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. Lady Morgana, elegant in black silk with silver hair that marked her as very old indeed, spoke first. "So this is the human the lords of Nareth sent you," she said, her voice carrying the crisp accent of old nobility. "How interesting." "Lady Elira is my honored guest," Kaelen replied, his tone carrying a warning. "She's to be treated with all courtesy, due her position." "Of course," Lord Victor said smoothly, though his smile never reached his eyes. "We merely wish to meet the woman who has captured our lord's attention so thoroughly. The Eastern Territories are abuzz with speculation." "What kind of speculation?" Elira asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Lord Sebastian, the youngest of the three, laughed, a sound without warmth. Whether our Lord has finally succumbed to the madness that sometimes affects ancient ones. Taking a human bride, especially one so obviously selected as an insult, it raises questions about judgment. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Kaelen's expression didn't change, but Elira could feel the power radiating from him, like heat from a forge. "You question my judgment?" he said quietly. "We question your priorities," Lady Morgana replied, apparently unintimidated. "For 3 centuries, you've led our people wisely. But this sudden fixation on a human woman, one chosen specifically to mock you, suggests a troubling loss of perspective." "What would you have me do?" Kaelen asked. "Send her back to appease the human lord's expectations? Abandon the possibility of companionship to maintain your comfort?" "We would have you remember that you are our alpha," Victor said. "Your choices affect every vampire in the territories. Taking a human bride sends a message of weakness to our enemies and confusion to our allies." Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger. And what message does it send to abandon someone because others disapprove? What does that say about vampire honor? The 3 visitors turned to her in surprise, as if they had forgotten she could speak. Lady Morgana's eyebrows rose elegantly. "The human has opinions," she observed. "This human has a name," Elira replied firmly, "and she has eyes and ears. I've spent the last week in this castle, and what I've seen is a leader who inspires loyalty through kindness rather than fear, who has built a society based on mutual respect rather than dominance. If that's madness, then perhaps madness is preferable to the alternative." "You speak boldly for someone in your position," Sebastian said with a sneer. "My position?" Elira stood straighter, feeling strength flow through her that she hadn't known she possessed. "You mean as someone who was sent here as a deliberate insult? As someone who wasn't supposed to be worthy of your lord's attention? Yes, I know exactly what my position was supposed to be. But Lord Kaelen saw past the cruelty of those who sent me, just as I have learned to see past the stories told about your kind." Kaelen moved to stand beside her, and she felt the warmth of his presence like a shield. "Lady Elira speaks truly. I chose to see worth where others saw only mockery, and I've been rewarded with the most honest companionship I've known in decades." "Pretty words," Victor said dismissively. "But what happens when the novelty fades? When you remember the difference between eternal and temporary, between our kind and theirs?" "Then I suppose I'll have to make a choice about what matters most," Kaelen replied. "Just as you'll have to choose whether you trust my judgment or whether you prefer the certainty of isolation." The confrontation continued for another hour, with the visiting nobles pressing their concerns while Kaelen deflected their arguments with patient determination. Throughout it all, Elira remained silent, but she could feel the weight of their scrutiny and the knowledge that her presence here had created ripples she hadn't anticipated. When the visitors finally departed, promising to carry word of the conversation back to their territories, Kaelen sank into his chair with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. "I'm sorry you had to endure that," he said. "I had hoped to spare you such unpleasantness." "Are they right?" Elira asked quietly. "Am I causing problems for you with your people?" Kaelen looked up at her with eyes that held both affection and determination. "You're causing change, which some find uncomfortable. But change isn't always a bad thing, even when it's difficult. And if they demand you choose between me and your responsibilities as their leader?" His smile was sad but certain. Then they'll learn that some choices are easier to make than others might think. 3 days after the confrontation with the Eastern Lords, Elira woke to the sound of commotion in the courtyard below her window. Voices carried on the cold mountain air, urgent, worried tones that made her pulse quicken with alarm. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where she found the household in a state of controlled urgency. Helena met her at the bottom of the stairs, her usually composed face tight with concern. "My lady, there's been an incident. Scouts report that something has attacked one of our outlying settlements, Millbrook, the farming community in the valley below. Attacked by what? We don't know yet. Lord Kaelen has gone to investigate with a party of our guards. He left word that you were to stay within the castle walls until he returns." Elira's heart clenched with worry. In the short time she had known Kaelen, she had come to understand that he would never ask his people to face dangers he wouldn't face himself. "How long has he been gone?" "Since before dawn. It's nearly noon now." The day passed with agonizing slowness. Elira tried to distract herself with books, but the words blurred together meaninglessly. She helped in the kitchen, reorganized her already tidy chambers, and finally found herself pacing the battlements, despite the bitter wind that whipped across the castle walls. As afternoon shadows lengthened, a horn sounded from the watchtower, the signal for an approaching party. Elira rushed to the main courtyard, just as the gates swung open to admit Kaelen and his guards. Relief flooded through her when she saw him unharmed, but her joy quickly faded when she noticed the grim set of his features and the way the other vampires moved with the careful alertness of soldiers expecting trouble. "What happened?" she asked as he dismounted from his black stallion. "Something that should not have been possible," he replied, his voice carrying an edge she had never heard before. "The attack was carried out by vampires, rogue ones who have abandoned the treaties and returned to the old ways." Dr. Whitmore approached, his scholarly face creased with worry. "How many casualties?" "None, fortunately. The farmers had warning enough to retreat to the safe houses we established years ago. But the rogues made their message clear. They burned the crops and left warnings written in blood on the barn walls." "What kind of warnings?" Elira asked, though she dreaded the answer. Kaelen's eyes met hers, and she saw anger there, cold, controlled, but blazing. They called for an end to what they termed my human corruption. They demanded that I cease my association with mortal influences and return to traditional vampire ways. The implications hit her like a physical blow. "They're targeting me." "They're targeting what you represent," Kaelen corrected. "Change, progress, the possibility that we might be something more than the monsters we once were." Thomas approached with a scroll in his hands. "My lord, this arrived by Raven while you were away. The seal is from Lord Victor." Kaelen read the message quickly, his expression darkening further. "It seems our visitors from yesterday have been busy. Victor writes to inform me that several vampire territories have declared their intention to reject my leadership if I proceed with this marriage. They're calling for a formal challenge to my authority." "A challenge?" Elira's blood ran cold. "What does that mean?" "In our oldest traditions, an alpha's right to rule can be contested through combat," Dr. Whitmore explained gravely. "It's an ancient law that hasn't been invoked in over a century." "They want you to fight?" "They want me to prove that I'm still strong enough to lead our people," Kaelen said grimly. "The theory being that if I'm too distracted by human concerns to maintain proper vigilance, I'm unfit to protect vampire interests." Elena appeared at Elira's side, her young face pale with worry. "You're not going to accept, are you? It's obviously a trap. If I refuse, they'll claim I've grown weak and use that as justification for open rebellion. Kaelen replied. If I accept and lose, they install a new Alpha, who will certainly end any hope of continued peace with the human kingdoms. And if you win? Then I prove that my judgment remains sound and my strength undiminished. He touched her arm gently. But the very fact that such a challenge has been issued puts you in danger. The rogues who attacked Millbrook were just the beginning. There will be others who see you as the source of division among our people. That evening, as they sat before the fire in his study, Kaelen showed Elira something she had never seen before. The blood goblet, an ancient chalice carved from dark stone and inlaid with silver runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. This is used in our most solemn ceremonies, he explained, turning the cup in his hands. Traditionally, when a vampire takes an eternal mate, both parties drink from it as a symbol of their bond. The ritual has not been performed in living memory. Most of us abandoned such customs long ago. Why are you showing me this? Because I want you to understand what you've become part of, he said seriously. This isn't simply about a marriage arrangement anymore. Your presence here has forced questions that my people have avoided for centuries. What are we? What do we want to become? Are we forever bound to the darkness of our past, or can we choose something different? Elira reached out to touch the goblet, and she could swear she felt warmth emanate from the ancient stone. And what do you believe? I believe that 3 centuries of peace have shown us a better way. I believe that isolation bred the very cruelties that made us monsters in the first place. And I believe that you've shown me possibilities I thought were lost forever. Even if it costs you your position, your people's loyalty? Kaelen set the goblet aside and took her hands in his. Elira, in my long life, I've learned that some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost seems too high. You've given me something I thought I'd lost. Hope. Hope that I might not have to spend eternity alone. Hope that my people might choose growth over stagnation. Hope that love might be stronger than fear. Love! The word escaped her lips as barely a whisper. Yes, he said simply. I know it's sudden, and I know the circumstances are complicated, but I've fallen in love with your courage, your kindness, your refusal to be diminished by those who tried to make you feel small. You've made me remember what it means to be more than just a survivor. Tears spilled down her cheeks, tears of joy mixed with terror. I love you too, she managed, but I'm so afraid. What if loving me destroys everything you've built? Then we'll build something new, he said with quiet certainty. Together. Outside the study windows, snow began to fall again. But inside by the fire, 2 hearts that had thought themselves condemned to loneliness found warmth in each other's presence. Neither of them spoke of the challenges ahead, the battles that would need to be fought, or the choices that would have to be made. For this moment, it was enough to know that they would face whatever came together. The blood goblet sat silent on the table beside them, waiting for the ceremony that would either unite them forever or become a memorial to a love that circumstances wouldn't allow to flourish. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after Kaelen had declared his intention to accept the formal challenge to his leadership. Elira woke to the sound of steel ringing against steel and shouts echoing through the castle corridors. She threw on her robe and rushed to the window, where the sight below made her blood freeze in her veins. Vampire warriors in unfamiliar colors had breached the outer walls and were fighting Kaelen's guards in the courtyard. But what terrified her most was the sight of Kaelen himself, surrounded by 3 opponents whose skill was clearly formidable. Even as she watched, She saw him stagger under a blow that would have killed a human instantly. Without thinking, she grabbed the first weapon she could find, an ornate letter opener from her writing desk, and ran toward the battle. She had no training in combat, no supernatural strength or speed, but she couldn't stand idle while the man she loved fought for his life. She had barely reached the main hall when strong hands seized her from behind. She struggled against her captor, expecting to see one of the attacking vampires, but instead found herself looking into the familiar face of Dr. Whitmore. His scholarly demeanor had been replaced by something cold and calculating that made her stomach drop. "I'm sorry, my dear," he said, with what seemed like genuine regret. "But I'm afraid your participation in today's events ends here." "Dr. Whitmore, what are you doing? Lord Kaelen needs to learn the consequences of poor judgment," he interrupted, producing a length of rope from beneath his coat. "And you, unfortunately, have become the instrument of that education." As he bound her hands with practiced efficiency, the pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. "You," she breathed, "you're the betrayer. You've been working against him from the beginning." "Working for the good of our people," he corrected. "Kaelen has been a strong leader, but strength without wisdom leads to destruction. His infatuation with you has blinded him to the damage he's causing to vampire unity. The rogue attacks, you organized them. I provided information about which settlements would be most vulnerable, yes, and I ensured that the warnings left behind would point suspicion toward external threats, rather than internal ones." He guided her toward a side door she hadn't noticed before. "The challenge to his authority was also my suggestion to Lord Victor. Everything has proceeded exactly as planned." Elira's mind raced as he led her through passages she didn't recognize. "Planned for what? What do you hope to accomplish by destroying Kaelen?" "Not destroying, redirecting. When this day is over, he will have learned that placing personal desires above the needs of his people leads to catastrophic consequences. You will be gone. He will have been humbled, and our society can return to the stability we've enjoyed for 3 centuries. They emerged into a small chamber, deep within the castle's foundation, where flickering torches cast dancing shadows on stone walls. To Elira's shock, she found Lord Victor and Lady Morgana waiting, along with a figure she hadn't expected to see, Lord Brennan from the human court, still wearing his travelling clothes and looking smugly satisfied. "Ah, the bride arrives," Victor said with mock courtesy. "Right on schedule." "You're working together," Elira realized, her voice hollow with the implications. "Humans and vampires. You planned this entire charade from the beginning." Lord Brennan smiled with the same cruel satisfaction she remembered from that day in the Great Hall. "Did you really think we would leave something as important as the Vampire Alliance to chance?" The moment Lord Kaelen made his request for a bride, we saw an opportunity to solve multiple problems at once. "What problems?" "Kaelen has grown too comfortable in his position," Lady Morgana explained with clinical detachment. "Too willing to accommodate human concerns, too focused on integration rather than vampire superiority. Some of us remember what it was like when our people commanded proper respect. And from the human perspective," Brennan continued, "a vampire lord with romantic notions about peace and cooperation is far more dangerous than one who maintains traditional boundaries. Your presence here has proven that Kaelen can be manipulated through his emotions, a weakness we cannot allow in someone so powerful." Dr. Whitmore produced a scroll from his robes, parchment that bore the distinctive seal she now recognized as the betrayer's seal, marking correspondence between the conspirators. "The beauty of the plan is its simplicity. We send you, here knowing that Kaelen's sense of honor would prevent him from simply disposing of you. We anticipated that he might develop feelings, but we underestimated how completely he would compromise himself. The challenge to his authority forced him to divide his attention between politics and protection, Victor added. Today's attack will drive home the consequences of that division when he discovers that his distraction allowed enemies to capture the very person he sought to protect. "You're going to kill me," Elira said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "Not immediately," Brennan replied. "First, you're going to help us deliver a message that will ensure Lord Kaelen's cooperation going forward. He'll learn that his future romantic entanglements will be subject to our approval, and that any further attempts at social reform will result in your immediate execution." The sound of battle had grown closer while they spoke, and now the clash of steel rang through the stone corridors above them. Victor tilted his head, listening with supernatural senses. "It sounds as though our Lord is prevailing in his fights," he observed. "No matter. The real victory was never going to be won through combat." Lady Morgana moved to a table where several items waited, including a vial of dark liquid that made Elira's skin crawl just looking at it. "This will ensure that you remain unconscious during transport. When you wake, you'll be far from here, in a location where Lord Kaelen's rescue attempts will be futile." "Transport where?" "A secure facility maintained by certain human lords who understand the value of leverage," Brennan said. "You'll be kept alive and relatively comfortable as long as your vampire lover maintains proper behavior." As Lady Morgana approached with the vial, Elira felt desperation claw at her chest. Everything Kaelen had built, everything they had discovered together, would be destroyed by this betrayal. Worse, she would become the instrument of his torment, a chain around his neck for the rest of his immortal life. But as Morgana reached for her, Elira remembered something Kaelen had told her during one of their quiet conversations in the library. "Every vampire has a weakness," she said suddenly. "Something that can be exploited if you're clever enough to find it." "Meaningless philosophy won't help you now," Victor sneered. "No, but Dr. Whitmore's scholarly pride might?" Elira looked directly at the man who had seemed so kindly just days before. "You've orchestrated all of this, haven't you? The perfect betrayal, executed with surgical precision. But you made one crucial error. And what would that be? You assumed that Kaelen trusted you because he valued your counsel, but he actually valued your counsel because he knew you were watching him. He's known about your divided loyalties for months." The confidence in Dr. Whitmore's expression flickered. "Impossible. He told me about the letters he intercepted, correspondence that never reached their intended destinations because he was controlling the information flow. Every secret message you sent to your allies was actually crafted by Kaelen himself." Elira felt a surge of desperate hope as she saw uncertainty creep into their faces. Today's attack isn't happening despite his preparation. It's happening because of it. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, but these were measured, unhurried, the steps of someone approaching by choice rather than necessity. When the chamber door swung open, Kaelen stood framed in the entrance, flanked by guards whose loyalty had never been in question. He was unharmed, Elira noted with relief, though his clothes showed evidence of combat. In his hand was a sword whose blade still gleamed with traces of blood, not his own, she realized. "Dr. Whitmore," he said conversationally, as if greeting an old friend. "Lord Victor, Lady Morgana, Lord Brennan. I trust you found the accommodations suitable for your clandestine meeting." "How did you—" Victor began. Find you? The same way I've been tracking your conspiracy for the past 6 months. Kaelen stepped into the chamber, and the temperature seemed to drop with his presence. Did you really think you could coordinate something this elaborate without leaving traces? Every message, every meeting, every plan, I've known about it all. Then why did you allow it to proceed? Dr. Whitmore demanded, his scholarly composure finally cracking. Kaelen's smile was sharp as a blade. Because I needed to know how deep the rot went, how many of my people were willing to betray centuries of progress for the comfort of old prejudices, and because I needed you to reveal yourselves completely before I acted. You used Elira as bait, Morgana accused. I used myself as bait, Kaelen corrected, moving to cut Elira's bonds with swift efficiency. Elira was always under protection you never saw because you were too focused on your own cleverness to notice the obvious. As the ropes fell away, Elira saw the truth in his eyes. This had all been a carefully orchestrated test, and she had been both participant and protected asset. The fear, the danger, the desperate love they had discovered, all of it had been real. But it had also been watched, guarded, controlled by someone who understood the game being played far better than his enemies. The question now, Kaelen continued, is what to do with traitors who thought they could manipulate me through the woman I love. The great hall of Kaelen's castle had been transformed into a tribunal chamber, with ancient vampire law demanding that formal judgment be rendered before the assembled court. Word had spread quickly through the mountain territories, and by evening, representatives from every major vampire house had arrived to witness what many considered the most significant gathering in 3 centuries. Elira stood beside Kaelen, on the raised platform where normally only the lord of the castle would appear. The past hours had been a whirlwind of revelation and preparation as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Dr. Whitmore's careful notes, recovered from his chambers, detailed not only the plot against Kaelen, but plans for a complete restructuring of vampire society, a return to the old ways of blood and dominance. "Are you ready for this?" Kaelen asked quietly, as the last of the assembled nobles took their places in the hall below. "I'm not sure anyone could be ready for this," Elira replied honestly, "but I understand what's at stake now." She did understand, perhaps more clearly than she wished. This wasn't simply about their relationship, or even about Kaelen's leadership. This was about the fundamental question of what vampires would become in the centuries ahead, whether they would continue on the path of integration and growth, or return to the isolation and cruelty that had defined them for millennia. On the table before them lay the sword of truth, an ancient blade whose origins were lost to legend. According to vampire law, it could only be wielded by one pure of heart, and its presence would determine not only the guilt or innocence of the accused, but the righteousness of the cause itself. "My lord," Thomas announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "the court is assembled and ready to hear judgment." Kaelen rose, and the assembled vampires fell silent. Even those who had opposed him could not deny the presence he commanded. The weight of centuries, the authority earned through countless decisions that had kept their people safe and prosperous. "We gather tonight to address charges of treason against the vampire nation," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "But before we examine the guilt of individuals, we must examine the principles they sought to defend through betrayal." He gestured to the prisoners, Dr. Whitmore, Victor, Morgana, and Lord Brennan, who stood under heavy guard near the center of the hall. These individuals believed that my recent choices, particularly my decision to welcome a human bride, represented a dangerous departure from vampire tradition. They coordinated a complex conspiracy to remove what they saw as corrupting influences from our society. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd. Elira noticed that opinion seemed divided. Some faces showed approval of Kaelen's words, while others displayed the same disapproval she had seen in Victor and his allies. "Lord Kaelen," called a voice from the crowd. Elira recognized Lord Sebastian, the young vampire from the Eastern Territories. While we do not condone treason, many of us share the concern that underlies their actions. How do you answer the charge that your personal feelings have compromised your judgment as our leader? "By asking a question in return," Kaelen replied. "What is the purpose of leadership? Is it to maintain the status quo regardless of whether that serves our people's interests? Or is it to guide our kind toward the best possible future, even when that requires difficult changes?" He moved to stand beside the sword of truth, and Elira noticed that several vampires leaned forward, as if drawn by some invisible force emanating from the ancient weapon. 300 years ago, our people were dying, Kaelen continued. Not from external enemies, but from our own nature. The blood hunger drove us to acts that turned every human against us, making us hunted creatures living in fear. The treaty that ended the blood wars saved us from extinction, but it also forced us to confront what we had become. Lady Morgana, despite her restraints, managed to speak, and we adapted. We found ways to survive without compromise. There was no need to embrace human values or seek integration. "Survival is not the same as thriving," Kaelen replied. "For 3 centuries, we've hidden in these mountains, maintaining our strength, but sacrificing our growth. We've become stagnant, afraid to change because change carries risk." He lifted the sword of truth from the table, and Elira gasped as the blade began to glow with a soft, white light. The assembled vampires stirred uneasily. According to legend, the sword would only respond to one whose cause was truly just. "The human woman who stands beside me was sent here as an insult," Kaelen said, his voice growing stronger as the sword's light intensified. "But she has become something far more significant. Proof that our 2 peoples can find common ground, that love and understanding can bridge even the deepest divides." "Pretty words," Victor called out, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "But what happens when your human lover ages and dies? What happens when the reality of our different natures destroys your romantic idealism?" "Then I will have learned something about the nature of love and loss," Kaelen replied. "But that is a choice I should be free to make, just as each of you should be free to choose your own path forward." He turned to address the crowd directly. "The conspiracy against me was based on fear that change would destroy what we've built, fear that integration would weaken us, fear that love might prove stronger than the isolation that has defined us for centuries. But I have seen what isolation brings, and I choose something different." Elena stepped forward from her place among the household staff, carrying a small wooden chest that Elira hadn't seen before. When she opened it, the contents glowed with the same ethereal light as the sword, dozens of small objects that looked like crystallized starlight. "These are phoenix feathers," Kaelen explained, "formed when a vampire undergoes true transformation, when they choose love over fear, growth over stagnation, hope over despair. They haven't been seen in our territories for over 2 centuries, because we stopped believing such transformation was possible." He took one of the glowing objects from the chest, and Elira felt warmth radiate from it like sunlight. Lady Elira's presence in our castle has begun to change, not just me, but all of us who have opened our hearts to possibility. The feathers appeared 3 days ago, in the garden where she and I first spoke of love. The murmurs in the crowd had grown louder, some excited, others troubled. Elira realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented, a leader asking his people to choose their own evolution rather than having change imposed upon them. "The choice before us tonight is simple," Kaelen continued. "Do we punish those who betrayed us and return to the certainties of isolation? Do we embrace the unknown possibilities of integration and growth? Or do we find a third path that honors both our traditions and our potential?" Dr. Whitmore spoke from his place among the prisoners, his scholarly voice carrying even in restraints. "You speak of choice, but you've already made yours. You've chosen a human over your own kind, change over stability, romantic fantasy over practical reality." "I've chosen love over fear," Kaelen replied simply. "And I believe that choice can strengthen rather than weaken us, if we're brave enough to explore what it might mean." He raised the sword of truth above his head, and its light filled the entire hall, casting away shadows and illuminating faces that seemed transformed by its radiance. "I call upon ancient lore and ancient wisdom. Let those who believe in the path of growth stand with me. Let those who prefer the certainties of isolation speak their opposition. And let those who cannot choose ask for more time to consider." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the castle's high windows. Then, slowly, movement began in the crowd. Elena was the first to step forward, followed by Helena and Thomas and the other household staff who had come to know Elira. Then came vampires Elira didn't recognize, younger ones mostly, but also some who bore the marks of great age. But others remained in place, their faces troubled or openly hostile. And still others shifted uncertainly, caught between competing loyalties and unsure which path offered the greater wisdom. "The court is divided," observed Lord Sebastian, though his own position remained unclear. "What would you have us do when neither choice commands unanimous support?" Kaelen lowered the sword, though its light continued to bathe the hall in ethereal radiance. "I propose a trial period, 1 year in which those who wish to explore integration may do so, while those who prefer traditional ways are free to maintain their own communities. At the end of that time, we reconvene to evaluate the results of both approaches." "And the traitors," called a voice from the crowd, "will face justice according to the laws they chose to break," Kaelen replied. "But their punishment will be determined by the entire community, not imposed by me alone." He looked directly at Elira, and she saw in his eyes both love and the terrible responsibility of leadership. "The woman who stands beside me has shown me possibilities I thought were lost forever. Whether those possibilities become reality depends on all of us, on our willingness to choose courage over comfort, growth over certainty, hope over fear." The assembled vampires began to murmur among themselves, some forming groups to discuss the proposal, others departing to carry word back to their territories. The formal trial would continue tomorrow, but Elira could sense that something fundamental had shifted in the room. The old certainties had been challenged, and while not everyone was ready to embrace change, few could deny that the status quo was no longer sufficient. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Kaelen set the sword of truth back on its ceremonial stand and turned to Elira with an expression of mingled exhaustion and hope. "Tomorrow we'll discover whether love truly can be stronger than fear," he said quietly. "Tonight, we rest and prepare for whatever comes." Elira took his hand, feeling the warmth of the phoenix feather he still held, and the solid strength of the man who had risked everything for the possibility of transformation. Whatever comes, we face it together. Outside the castle walls, snow continued to fall on the mountain peaks, but inside the great hall, the light of the sword of truth lingered like a promise of dawn. The second day of the tribunal dawned grey and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the mountain peaks. In the hours before the final session, Elira found herself in the castle's highest tower, looking out over a landscape that seemed to mirror the uncertainty within the great hall below. The assembled vampire lords had spent the night in heated debate, and she could sense the tension that permeated every stone of the ancient castle. A soft knock at the tower door announced Helena's arrival, carrying with her an object that made Elira's breath catch: the Mirror of Souls, an artifact she had only heard described in whispered legends. The mirror's surface seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, and looking into it felt like gazing into the depths of a still mountain lake. "Lord Kaelen asked me to bring this to you," Helena said quietly. "He believes it may be needed today." "What does it do?" "It shows the true nature of anyone who looks into it," Helena explained, her voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. "No deception can survive its scrutiny. No pretense can withstand its sight. Those who look upon it see themselves as they truly are, and others see that truth as well." Elira approached the mirror cautiously, drawn by its ethereal beauty, but wary of what she might discover about herself. When her reflection appeared in the silvered surface, she gasped at what she saw. The woman looking back at her was still recognizably herself, but transformed. Confidence radiated from her bearing, kindness shone in her eyes, and something that could only be described as inner strength seemed to illuminate her from within. "You see it now," Helena observed with satisfaction. "What Lord Kaelen saw from the very beginning. What the human lords were too blind to recognize. True beauty that comes from character rather than appearance. I hardly recognize myself. Because for the first time in your life, you're seeing yourself as you truly are, rather than as others have told you to see yourself." Helena wrapped the mirror in soft cloth, preparing it for transport to the great hall. Today, everyone will have that same opportunity. In the great hall, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The conspirators stood before the assembled court, their restraints removed, but their faces bearing the weight of certain judgment. Dr. Whitmore maintained his scholarly composure, but Victor and Morgana showed signs of the strain they had endured through the long night of deliberation. Lord Brennan, the human representative, looked particularly uncomfortable surrounded by vampires whose patience with his kind had worn thin during the proceedings. Kaelen took his place at the center of the raised platform, the sword of truth gleaming in his hand, and the mirror of souls positioned where all could see it. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the vast hall. "We gather to render final judgment on those who sought to destroy the bonds of trust that hold our society together," he began. "But before we pronounce sentence, let truth be revealed in its purest form." He gestured to the mirror of souls, and its surface began to glow with the same ethereal light that had emanated from the phoenix feathers. "Let each of the accused look upon themselves as they truly are, and let their motivations be known to all." Dr. Whitmore was the first to be brought before the mirror. As he gazed into its surface, his reflection showed not the kindly scholar he appeared to be, but a figure consumed by bitter resentment and frustrated ambition. The image revealed a man who had spent decades watching others receive recognition for achievements he believed should have been his, whose betrayal stemmed not from principle but from personal grievance. "I see a man who forgot that wisdom and knowledge serve their highest purpose when used for others rather than self, Kaelen observed quietly. A man who allowed wounded pride to corrupt judgment. Victor came next, and his reflection revealed something even more disturbing. A vampire whose longing for the old days of blood and dominance had never truly faded, whose opposition to change stemmed from a deep-seated craving for the power and fear that vampires had once commanded. In the mirror's depths, his true face showed the monster he had worked to keep hidden. Lady Morgana's reflection was perhaps the most tragic. It showed not evil, but fear, a terror of change so profound that it had driven her to betrayal in a desperate attempt to preserve the only world she understood. Her centuries of existence had left her unable to imagine any future different from the past. Finally, Lord Brennan stood before the mirror, and what appeared in its surface made several vampires hiss with disgust. His reflection showed not just cruelty and prejudice, but a man whose hatred of vampires was matched only by his contempt for his own people, particularly for those like Elira, whom he considered beneath his notice. "I see the truth of their motivations," Kaelen announced, his voice heavy with sadness rather than anger. "Fear, resentment, prejudice, and wounded pride. These drove them to betray not just me, but the hopes and dreams of every person who dared to believe that our two peoples might find common ground." But as the mirror's light continued to bathe the hall, something unexpected began to happen. Other vampires found themselves compelled to look into its surface, and one by one, they too were forced to confront their own true natures. Some saw nobility and courage, others discovered fears and prejudices they had hidden even from themselves. Lord Sebastian approached the mirror voluntarily, and his reflection showed a young vampire torn between respect for tradition and hunger for growth, whose opposition to Kaelen had stemmed not from malice, but from genuine uncertainty about the path forward. "I see," he said quietly, his voice carrying to the assembled crowd, "that I have let fear of the unknown cloud my judgment of the possible." As more vampires looked into the mirror of souls, a remarkable transformation began to occur in the hall. Pretense fell away, hidden motivations were revealed, and for the first time in centuries, the vampire court saw itself with complete honesty. Some of what was revealed was troubling, prejudices that ran deeper than admitted, fears that had shaped decisions for decades, resentments that had poisoned relationships. But much of what appeared in the mirror's depths was inspiring. Nobility that had been hidden by cynicism, courage that had been masked by caution, and love that had been suppressed by the fear of vulnerability. "Now we see ourselves truly," Kaelen said, as the last of the assembled nobles stepped back from the mirror. "And now we can choose our path forward with full knowledge of who we are and who we might become." The hall had fallen silent, but it was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the quiet of profound realization, the moment when truth cuts through confusion and clarity emerges from chaos. The silence in the great hall stretched like a held breath until Elira stepped forward, her voice clear and steady in the profound quiet. "May I address the court?" Kaelen nodded, though she could see concern in his eyes. She had not discussed this moment with him, but something about the mirror's revelations had crystallized her understanding of what needed to be said. "I stand before you as the woman who was sent here as an insult," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "I was chosen not for my beauty or nobility, or any quality that might honor your lord, but specifically because my presence was meant to shame him." She moved closer to the mirror of souls, and her reflection appeared again in its shimmering surface. The woman transformed by love and acceptance, radiating the quiet strength that had always been within her. But what I found here was not shame or disgust or the contempt I had known all my life. I found a man who saw worth where others saw only mockery, who chose to look deeper than appearance or station or the expectations of his peers. She turned to face the assembled vampires, meeting their eyes without flinching. And in learning to see myself through his eyes, I discovered something remarkable. That love has the power to transform not just how others see us, but how we see ourselves. A ripple of movement passed through the crowd as her words settled into the silence. She could see faces that had been hard with judgment beginning to soften, could sense the shift in the hall's emotional atmosphere. The conspirators who sought to use me as a weapon against your lord believed that love was a weakness, she continued. They thought that caring for someone outside your own kind would make you vulnerable, would compromise your strength, would dilute your purpose. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled nobles. They were wrong. Elena appeared beside her, carrying one of the phoenix feathers that had manifested in the castle gardens. The crystalline object pulsed with warm light, and Elira felt courage flow through her as she took it in her hands. Love didn't make Lord Kaelen weaker. It made him more determined to build something worthy of protection. It didn't cloud his judgment. It clarified his vision of what your people could become. It didn't divide his loyalty. It expanded his understanding of what loyalty truly means. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward from among the prisoners, his scholarly composure finally cracking under the weight of what he was witnessing. Pretty words from a human who knows nothing of our history, our struggles, our sacrifices to maintain what we've built. You're right, Elira replied calmly. I don't know your history the way you do, but I know what I've seen in this castle. Vampires who chose growth over stagnation, who chose hope over fear, who chose to see possibilities rather than limitations. She held up the phoenix feather, and its light seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. And I know that transformation is always possible, for anyone brave enough to choose it. She moved to stand directly before the mirror of souls, and her reflection blazed with inner light that made several vampires gasp in wonder. Look at me, now, she said, her voice strong and clear. Not the woman who was sent here as an insult, but the woman who found her voice in the shadow of a man who chose love over prejudice. This is what transformation looks like. Not the loss of who you were, but the discovery of who you were always meant to be. Lord Sebastian stepped forward, his young face showing the struggle between old certainties and new possibilities. But what if the cost is too high? What if opening ourselves to change destroys the stability we've fought so hard to maintain? Then we'll face those consequences together, Kaelen said, moving to stand beside Elira. As he took her hand, the phoenix feather's light intensified, casting rainbows through the great hall. But I'd rather risk the uncertainty of growth than accept the slow death of stagnation. Helena approached, carrying the blood goblet, its ancient stone surface gleaming with silver runes that seemed to dance in the artifact's ethereal light. My lord, she said formally, the household stands ready to witness whatever choice you make. Kaelen lifted the goblet, and every vampire in the hall seemed to lean forward, understanding instinctively what was being offered. According to their oldest traditions, drinking from the blood goblet in the presence of witnesses would create a bond that death itself could not break, but it would also transform Elira into something no longer entirely human. The choice is yours, he said quietly, offering her the cup. Remain as you are, beloved and cherished but ultimately mortal, or step fully into our world with all the risks and responsibilities that choice carries. Elira looked into the ancient goblet and saw her reflection multiplied in its silver runes, hundreds of possible futures, all centered around the man who had taught her to see her own worth. She thought of the cold castle where she had been nothing more than furniture, of the lords who had used her as a cruel joke, of all the years she had spent believing she was unworthy of love. Then she thought of the garden where impossible flowers bloomed, of quiet evenings reading by firelight, of conversations that challenged and comforted in equal measure. She thought of Helena's kindness, Eleanor's enthusiasm, Thomas's respectful service. She thought of a community that valued her for her heart, rather than dismissing her for her appearance. "I choose transformation," she said, taking the goblet in hands that trembled only slightly. "I choose love over fear, growth over safety, and a future I can't fully imagine over a past that never truly valued me." As she raised the cup to her lips, the assembled vampires fell silent, witnessing the moment when two worlds became one through the simple courage of a woman who had learned to see herself clearly and a man who had never stopped believing in the possibility of redemption. The transformation began even before she finished drinking, warmth flowing through her like sunlight, reshaping not just her body, but her very essence. And in that moment of profound change, she felt not loss but completion. The final piece of a puzzle she hadn't known was incomplete. 6 months had passed since the night Elira chose transformation, and the castle in the mountains had become something unprecedented in vampire history, a place where change was not only possible but celebrated. The Unity Chalice, forged from the melted remnants of both human and vampire ceremonial crowns, sat in the place of honor in the great hall, its gleaming surface reflecting the light of countless candles that burned in welcome rather than warning. Elira stood at the windows of what had once been Kaelen's private study and was now their shared sanctuary, watching the sun set over peaks that no longer seemed forbidding but beautiful. Her transformation had brought changes she was still discovering, enhanced senses that allowed her to appreciate the subtle music of wind through stone, strength that made her feel capable rather than fragile, and a connection to the natural world that ran deeper than anything she had experienced as a human. "The delegation from the Eastern Territories has arrived," Kaelen said from behind her, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man whose gamble had paid off beyond his wildest expectations. "Lord Sebastian sends word that 3 more vampire communities have requested permission to establish cultural exchanges with human settlements." "And the human kingdoms?" Growing more curious by the day, Lord Aldrich himself has requested a formal audience to discuss trade agreements. It seems that our success has made them reconsider their assumptions about what peaceful coexistence might accomplish. Elira turned from the window with a smile that still made Kaelen's centuries-old heart skip with wonder. The woman who had arrived at his castle as an intended insult had become the bridge between worlds that neither side had known they needed. The transformation had not been without challenges. In the weeks following her change, Elira had struggled with the enhanced emotions and physical capabilities that came with her new nature. There had been moments of doubt, nights when she wondered if she had chosen correctly, days when the weight of representing something unprecedented felt overwhelming. But those struggles had also brought unexpected gifts. The vampire community that had once viewed her with suspicion now looked to her as proof that change could strengthen rather than weaken their bonds. Human visitors to the castle found in her someone who understood both worlds and could speak to the fears and hopes of each. "The wedding preparations are complete," Helena announced, entering the study with the quiet efficiency that had made her invaluable during the months of political transformation. "The chapel is ready, and our guests have all arrived safely. Today would mark not just the formal celebration of their union, but the establishment of new protocols that would govern vampire-human relations for generations to come. Representatives from 12 kingdoms waited in the great hall below, along with vampire nobles who had once opposed Kaelen's vision, but now sought to understand how they might implement similar changes in their own territories. "Are you nervous?" Kaelen asked, as they prepared to descend to the ceremony. "Terrified," Elira admitted with a laugh. "But it's a good kind of terror, the kind that comes from knowing you're about to step into something wonderful and unknown." The chapel had been transformed for the occasion, decorated not with the traditional symbols of vampire power, but with arrangements that blended the roses from Kaelen's impossible garden with wildflowers gathered from human meadows. The unity chalice sat at the altar, flanked by candles whose light seemed to dance with the same ethereal glow that had emanated from the phoenix feathers. As they walked down the aisle together, a departure from tradition that symbolized their equal partnership, Elira saw faces in the assembled crowd that told the story of their journey. Elena beamed with the joy of a young woman who had found a mentor and friend. Dr. Whitmore, granted clemency in exchange for his scholarly expertise in documenting the changes taking place, watched with something that might have been genuine remorse for his earlier betrayals. Victor and Morgana were notably absent, having chosen exile over adaptation, but Lord Sebastian stood proudly among the witnesses, his young face bright with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered that growth was preferable to stagnation. Representatives from the human kingdoms watched with carefully controlled expressions, but Elira could sense their curiosity overwhelming their caution. The woman they had dismissed as worthless had become someone they needed to understand, and their presence here acknowledged a fundamental shift in how the two species viewed each other. The ceremony itself was brief but profound, drawing from both vampire and human traditions to create something entirely new. When they drank from the unity chalice together, the assembled crowd witnessed not just the union of two individuals, but the symbolic marriage of two ways of life that had been kept separate for far too long. "What I found in you," Kaelen said as they exchanged vows, "was not just love, but the courage to become more than I thought possible. You taught me that strength comes not from isolation, but from connection, not from power over others, but from partnership with them." "What I found in you," Elira replied, her voice clear and strong, "was someone who saw me as I truly was, rather than as others insisted I should be. You showed me that transformation is always possible, that love can indeed conquer fear, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the scariest choices." As they kissed to seal their union, phoenix feathers materialized in the air around them, dozens of crystalline fragments that caught the candlelight and scattered rainbows throughout the chapel. According to vampire legend, such manifestations occurred only when profound love created the possibility for unprecedented transformation. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, with vampire and human guests discovering that their differences were far less significant than their similarities. Treaties were negotiated, cultural exchanges arranged, and friendships formed that would reshape the political landscape of both communities for generations to come. On the final evening, as the last of their guests prepared to depart, Elira and Kaelen stood once again at the windows of their study, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Leaving your human life behind?" Elira considered the question seriously, as she considered all important things. "I regret the years I spent believing I was worth less than others saw in me. I regret the pain that prejudice caused on both sides of our conflict. But choosing you, choosing this life, choosing transformation over safety? Never. Even though the future is uncertain, especially because the future is uncertain, we've proven that change is possible, that love can bridge any divide, that courage can overcome the deepest fears. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together, and we'll face it as people who chose to believe in something better than what came before. Outside their window, snow began to fall on the mountain peaks, each flake unique and beautiful in its brief dance through the starlight. But inside their sanctuary, two hearts that had thought themselves condemned to loneliness had found not just love, but purpose, the chance to build a world where worth was measured by character rather than appearance, where differences were celebrated rather than feared, and where love truly could prove stronger than any force that sought to divide.